Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Sam.
I'm Emma.
In a dramatic turn of events, TikTok is back online in the US after being down for just 12 hours. The restoration comes after President Trump, who was officially inaugurated as the 47th President of the United States overnight, announced he would sign an executive order to delay the ban as he takes office this week. On today's podcast, Emma and I are going to break down what happened during this chaotic weekend for TikTok and what it means for the app's future in America.
Sam, we are waking up this morning to the beginning of the Trump administration.
Trump 2.0.
Trump 2.0 is here, the inauguration at about 4 a.m. for most of us. And it comes after this roller coaster TikTok saga for Americans, for users of the social media platform. Can you start by explaining why TikTok was banned in the US in the very first place?
Well, the first thing I want to acknowledge is just how strange it is that where there are so many issues that Americans voted on and talked about over the last many years, it's been weird that we have been fully focused almost on TikTok as the main legislative point in the lead up to this inauguration. But here we are. So this goes back about 9 months when the US Congress passed legislation with bipartisan support to ban TikTok. And bipartisan support means both Republicans and Democrats were in favor of this new rule. And the core reason for the ban was because of concerns around national security, specifically whether TikTok's parent company, called ByteDance, might share user data with the Chinese government. Now, to avoid the ban, ByteDance needed to sell its US component of its business to a non-Chinese entity. It didn't do that. TikTok tried to appeal the ban through the highest office in the country, that's the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court ruled last week that the ban could be upheld. And so TikTok went dark on Sunday ahead of the January 19 deadline. Not even after the deadline had passed, they got ahead of it.
Yeah, there were a variety of outcomes that we were bracing for, depending on that Supreme Court ruling. But then Trump intervened. He stepped in at the 11th hour. What exactly happened? What did he say?
So the app is dark and everyone's getting a notification saying, I'm sorry, you can't get onto TikTok. We hope to work with President Trump on a solution here. And that was because Trump announced he would issue an executive order on Monday, so his first day as president, to extend the timeline for TikTok to find a buyer. Just quickly covering off the executive order. So that's a direction issued by the president that has the force of law, but doesn't need to be passed by an act of Congress. All US presidents in history have issued executive orders on a variety of issues. In Trump's first term, he passed 220 executive orders in 4 years.
Wow.
Well, it's kind of a similar number-ish to quite a few other presidents.
Okay.
But what is different about how Trump wants to do his executive orders this time around is how quickly he wants to pass them. Mm-hmm. So he says he's going to sign at least 200 executive orders on his first day as president.
That would be close to the total number of executive orders he signed in his entire term as president last time.
Exactly. And the record since 1932 for the number of executive orders signed on the first day is Joe Biden. In 2021, he signed 9. Okay. So taking executive orders from 9 to 200 as a day one record is a pretty big jump. Now, under the current law, the president is given the power to extend the amount of time that TikTok have to do this sale to a non-Chinese entity by another 90 days. But he can only do that once, and it has to be done if there's evidence that the company is making significant progress in moving its ownership to another company, and they just need a bit more time to iron out the deal.
Okay, so just to recap, we've had a TikTok ban looming. It comes into place for 12 hours, and then Donald Trump intervenes and gives ByteDance, the parent company of TikTok, an extra 90 days to sell its US operations to a US company. So it's like a 90-day lifeline. Is that right?
Yeah, and I think what is really unprecedented about this is that there actually isn't much evidence that ByteDance are on the verge of a negotiation with a US entity. This is more about Trump trying to figure out a longer-term solution here. But you have to remember, this is now an act of law. And so the interesting battle that's emerging is, can a president via an executive order almost discredit a law that has already passed Congress, bipartisan support, and been tested by the Supreme Court, and tell parties involved that it's not going to be enforced. And this is really now a lot more than just about TikTok. This is about what the limits are to a president's powers.
And what an executive order can mean under different presidents, or who can take them to what place, and what boundaries are in place to restrict those actions.
Yeah.
It's a pretty big moment, or I suppose what Trump is potentially doing with the power of the executive order is rather unprecedented.
On day one.
So how has TikTok responded to all of this? I imagine they are welcoming that extension, but have they indicated any change in their position?
Well, they turned the app back on, which I think is the really big change that we need to take note of. They said in a statement that they were really thankful for President Trump for providing what they described as clarity and assurance to their service providers. They're framing this as a victory for free speech, calling it a strong stand for the First Amendment and against arbitrary censorship.
Now, I think it's interesting to talk about the implications for users, for the people who are on the platform, on TikTok. I think sometimes the kind of more traditional media, legacy media conversation around this topic can be maybe a little bit condescending or belittling of an app that is primarily used by young people, but is, arguably an important platform for a lot of people. What are the implications for those TikTok users in the US, for TikTok creators in America?
Well, there's 170 million Americans who have TikTok. So,
oh my God.
I mean, yeah.
That's a really big number.
It's huge. And TikTok estimated based on their data that if there was a ban, within the first month of a ban, businesses using the app, so they're using it on not just paid channels like paying for advertising to pop up for users, but also organic growth and a bit of PR and telling people about their products. They estimated that those businesses would lose about $1 billion in revenue in just the first month, and that content creators, influencers that you were mentioning before, could miss out on $300 million in revenue.
It's really hard to put a number on the business of TikTok, I guess. I mean, we have this number and it's a huge figure, but when you think about how we engage with social media from a business perspective, the way that, we come across brands or product reviews, there's, such a huge world of what the economy of social media looks like.
Well, there are entire companies built on TikTok adjacent services. They might be brands that just make vertical video ads for businesses. They might be companies who advise on TikTok strategy. There's entire companies, not just TikTok itself, but lots and lots of people impacted by this. But aside from the economic argument, we have to acknowledge the cultural argument and the social argument here. It's an enormous part of the social media landscape, and I think Trump knows that. And he certainly knows that saving an app that tens of millions of people use every day, especially young people, is going to increase his popularity with the young people that use it. He said one line in his statement on Truth Social. He said, "Americans deserve to see our exciting inauguration on Monday, as well as other events and conversations on TikTok." So I think there's also a little bit of, the Trump ego coming through there and wanting to see the virality of an inauguration on the app, which he now has.
Wow. So can this executive order solve the TikTok problem long term? We know that there's a 90-day extension. ByteDance essentially have, the next 2.5 months to find a US buyer for their US operations. From what you've told us today, Sam, it doesn't necessarily seem as though they have been seriously looking into cooperating with those demands from that previous legal action. So what is going to solve this problem in the long term?
Hi, I'm Ola.
And I'm Elliot.
We're the two-person team behind everything video and audio here at the Daily Aus.
If you want to help us grow so we can deliver more of the content that you love, be sure to hit subscribe.
Now let's get back to the video.
Let me keep it real simple. There's kind of two ways only that this can be solved long term. The first option is that TikTok gets sold to a US entity or a non-Chinese entity. The second option is that Congress reverses the law. So the president doesn't have the power to just strike out a law of Congress, especially a law that has bipartisan support, especially a law that's already been tested by the Supreme Court. So for a permanent solution, besides that, there's kind of not really anything else that can be done after that 90-day time. And that's where I think things get really murky.
what has the response been within Trump's own Republican Party? As you mentioned, there was bipartisan support for this ban. So is there pushback from within his party?
It's been really interesting. I mean, Trump himself was a big advocate of this law coming into effect, a couple of years ago, along with most of the Republican Party. And this was a really firm policy that they held. There was a couple of statements. Republican Senators Tom Cotton and Pete Ricketts said there's no legal basis to extend the ban's deadline beyond that 90-day period. And that is significant because they're from Trump's own party.
But Trump has proposed a solution. He put that statement out on Truth Social. What is President Trump's idea?
Well, he would like the United States to have a 50% ownership position in a joint venture. Those are his words. We're not quite sure whether he was referring to the US government and it becoming kind of a half state-owned entity or a US company. But he did say, without US approval, there is no TikTok. With our approval, it's worth hundreds of billions of dollars, maybe trillions.
So he's maybe appealing to ByteDance there by suggesting if they partnered with a US company or the US government, unclear, that would improve the value of their business, that there's an economic advantage to making a deal like that.
Definitely. And we're watching in real time the relationship between the Trump campaign and TikTok get closer and closer. I mean, TikTok's CEO was at the inauguration this morning. We've got lots of increased usage by the Trump team on the app. So it's going to be really interesting to see if, in fact, they turn out to work together.
One thing that's been interesting to watch is how other tech companies are reacting to this whole saga, how they've reacted to TikTok coming back online, particularly, the big app stores, players like Apple, Google. Ultimately, they will have a legal obligation in terms of hosting TikTok on their app stores, right?
I mean, the law is in effect right now. It's been signed, sealed, delivered. So even though the app is back up and running, it can't be downloaded on the Google and Apple app stores yet because they're not putting it back there until they know for sure they're out of the woods legally.
So if you are in the US right now and you didn't have TikTok installed on your device, you couldn't download it right now.
Exactly. The law itself is still valid and enforceable. ByteDance now has this, extra period to try and work out how to fix it long term. But right now, it's illegal for an app store to have TikTok. And in practice, it can have quite severe consequences for these types of service providers. We're talking $5,000 for each user who uses their service to access TikTok. So we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars potentially in fines. The law, interestingly, says that you can be fined as a company for up to 5 years after the breach. So let's say that you have a really TikTok sympathetic Trump for the next 4 years, but then a new president in year 5. That new president could order the law to be enforced for actions that Apple and Google take way back in early 2025. So it's pretty complicated. But I think the other question that companies are trying to ask right now is if President Trump says something on Truth Social, like companies are going to be protected if they put TikTok back, can they rely on a comment from the president if they're brought to court one day? And can they rely on the kind of sentiment that he's offering them to protect them from hundreds of millions of dollars of fines? It's
fascinating, and I can't think of a story like it previously when you have, such a prominent and powerful leader of, we hear about the US president being referred to as the leader of the free world. If they're saying one thing, but their Congress is doing another, what does that mean for everyone in the middle, from users to tech companies? And
the other thing to remember about companies like Apple and Google, who are kind of TikTok adjacent, is that they've got a lot of business on the go all at once, and their relationships to not only the president, but to all of the senators and members of Congress, people who are making the law and deciding what is regulated, is really important. And those two senators from the Republican Party I mentioned before, in that statement, Tom Cotton and Pete Ricketts, they said that they thanked those companies for following the rule of law, and they warned that despite an executive order, the law risks ruinous bankruptcy for any company who violates it.
Ruinous bankruptcy, some pretty strong terms there.
The name of a also very popular rap group, I'm sure, somewhere.
EP dropping this Friday from Ruinous Bankruptcy. Okay, so in terms of what comes next, Sam, you've laid out that there are these options of, another company comes in and buys those American operations from ByteDance within the 90 days, or TikTok does not have an interest in engaging in those conversations, so the app goes dark after 90 days. But if we're thinking about potential buyers, is there anyone that's put their hand up?
Well, there's a couple of big names. Nobody has really emerged as a front-running candidate here. We've heard that Elon Musk might be interested, Shark Tank judge Kevin O'Leary, YouTuber Mr. Beast, and a few other high-profile business figures. There was one high-profile billionaire who offered $20 billion in cash to ByteDance over the weekend. Just straight, I'll take it off your hands for this much. ByteDance rejected that offer. But yes, there's now this really firm deadline of the 90 days. It's a Trump presidency, so we're not quite sure what's going to happen after that 90 days. We don't know what President Trump's executive powers look like after that 90-day period has expired. So this will take longer than watching a TikTok video to figure out, and it's become a much more technical legal argument than I think any of us were expecting. But here we are. Welcome to Trump 2.0.
And interesting to see the regulation of social media in, the modern climate with the way that young people engage with it now being spoken about in the US. We, of course, had our own struggles in Australia last year, the uncertainty of news on meta platforms. And we will be continuing to watch closely to see what happens if Trump follows through with the executive order in the next few days, what that means for major platforms, and what it means above all else for users. Sam, thank you so much for taking us through that. That was really interesting.
Thanks, Em.
And thank you for joining us for today's episode. If you learned something from this one, please feel free to pass it on to a friend. Make sure you are following us wherever you listen, or subscribed over on YouTube if you're watching us over there. We will be back later on today with your evening headlines. But until then, have a great day.